Hey everybody. So in this video, we are going to be talking about lava terrain. So basically, this is a mod which changes the texture from moddable deep water to a lava texture. We can use this terrain in random maps to create some interesting mechanics, or we can just use it solely for decoration. So in this video, I'm going to be covering some of the ways that I use it, and hopefully we'll cover some things that aren't super straightforward when it comes to using this terrain. So if you want to make use of this terrain, you can just search for lava terrain mod on the AOE2 mod center, and you can download that to gain access to this texture. Now, lava terrain isn't exactly a new concept for my maps. Back in the day, I used to use terrain 15 for the lava texture because terrain 99 didn't exist back then. Now, terrain 15, for those who don't know, is shoreless water. So when we use this terrain index for our lava texture, it doesn't inherently create a beach around it like most water textures do. So if we go into an example, this map is the old version of molten moats. So basically the lava, which doesn't look like lava right now, but it's created as shoreless water, and basically that lava is sandwiched in between two strips of generic rock terrain, which is terrain 40. And that kind of a combination had an interesting mechanic in the sense that it made an area both impassable and unbuildable. So if we were trying to build something here, we can see that since this is rock terrain, there's no way to build anything on here. Now, the limitation when we transition lava terrain from terrain 15 to terrain 99 is that terrain 99, moddable deep water, is not shoreless, so it will inherently create a beach around it. So if we were to change lava from terrain 15 to terrain 99, we can see that it gave us some nice graphics for our lava, but the downside is that it inherently created a beach around it, which is not very visually appealing. And that's the way normal water terrains work, is they will inherently generate this standard beach when there is no other beach to border it already. So to get around this limitation, we can try to look for another beach texture that would look a lot better when it's bordering this lava terrain here. And if we go into our terrains, we can look, we have some beach textures here. And if we take a look at this one, which is beach wet rock, we can see that this will actually look rather nice around our lava terrain. So if we take a look at what terrain that is, beach wet rock, that is terrain 109. So if we change the generic rock terrain from 40 to 109, we can see that we have a map that's much more visually appealing, since the lava texture looks rather nice when it's bordering this darkened rock texture. But the downside of using that beach texture is that beach terrains have different properties from the rock terrain that we were using earlier. Since we saw earlier that these passages were unwallable, now that we have changed this to beach terrain, we can see that we are able to place walls on it now. So this constitutes a bit of an issue for us for multiple reasons. First, as we just went through, is that the intention of this map was to make it more aggressive and make the passages unwallable. And then second is we have a bit of a consistency issue here. Because if we take a look at the generic rock terrain here, and we take a look at the rock beach over here, these two terrains essentially look pretty much the same, and you would expect them to behave the same way if you saw them in the game. But we already saw that these terrains have different properties. One of them is able to be walled, and the other one is not. So in order to get around this issue, we can use Rms Effects to change the properties of walls to make it so they won't be able to be built on beach terrain. So if we go Effect Amount, we can set attribute. And what's nice about RMS Effects is that instead of affecting the attributes of a single unit, we can modify the attributes of an entire class of units based on their class. So for example, we have wall class here, 927. So basically what that means is every object that has the class of wall will be affected by this RMS effect attribute. And we are here. So we'll say wall class, and we're going to modify HTR terrain ID. And we need to change it to a terrain table that is restricted to be built on beach. So if we take a look down, we can see that its current terrain table is number 10. And if we wanted to change it to something else, see the same terrain table as a house, we can change that to terrain table 4. And since houses are restricted to be built on beach terrain, that should transfer that same sort of property over to all types of walls. So if we go into the new version of Molten Moats, we can see we launched a standard game, and we can see that if we try to build walls on top of this beach terrain, we can see that that's no longer possible. So that's one of the good ways in which we can preserve the intention of the map and still preserve the consistency when we see this alongside potentially other colors of rock terrain, which can appear in other maps. And while we're here, we can also use RMS effects to help us with the placement of our objects in the map. So if you don't know already, turkeys are not restricted to being placed on beach terrain. So since we have this strip of beach that's connecting the player zone to the outside zone, it still could potentially be possible for turkeys to be placed outside of here as long as the min and max distance to players is respected. Now, if we were to change the properties of turkeys to be restricted for beach terrain, we could make it so they would never be able to spawn outside of the player zone and always be more easily accessible. So if we go back into here, we can set the attribute of turkeys to have a terrain table that is also restricted for beach. I don't necessarily want us to set it to 4 because that's usually for buildings, but we know that deers are a restricted terrain to being placed on beach. So if we take a look at the deer's terrain table, we can see that deer have the terrain table of 1. So if we change this for turkeys, and for good measure, we'll also set it to boars. And doing those two things will ensure that the turkeys and boars will never spawn outside of this player zone, because there will always be separation from the outside zone by this restricted terrain. So that's one example of how we can use lava terrain in our maps. But it's important to note that this rocky beach is the only beach that's being present in our map here. Depending on the situation, you may also run into some other maps in which you would be needing more than one type of beach, and we can think about how to handle that. So the next example we'll take a look at is this map, which is Hawaii. So this is basically a migration style map, and the central island has this nice looking volcano in the middle. So the volcano is the only elevation on the map, so if players run towards this, they can get a hill bonus, but besides that, it doesn't really do much besides provide some decoration. So in this map, we have to be kind of careful because we have different types of beach. So the dark rock that's surrounding the lava is a beach terrain. And then we also have this normal beach terrain that's bordering the water. And so we want to be careful in how we restrict walls to make sure that we're not affecting the gameplay in a very invasive way. So the way that's done in this map is that since the volcano is pretty much just for decoration, we can construct the volcano using mostly normal rock terrain. So we can see this inner zone is the beach rock, and then on the outside we just have this generic rock. And if we want to make sure that that's the case, we can try to put some walls here, and we can see that we can place walls on the beach terrain but not on this generic rock terrain. And then when we create our lava, we can see that that's created on top of the beach terrain, so it doesn't inherently produce a less appealing type of beach. And then in order to darken the outside, we can use another terrain statement, which is masking the wet rock beach on top of the rock terrain, and then ends up blending in pretty nicely. So in this way, we can make a map where we can have this nice rocky terrain surrounding our lava, which is still unbuildable, and we can avoid having to affect the terrain properties of walls, because if we had restricted them for beach up here, then they would also be restricted for beach down here, which would be a pretty unfortunate side effect. So that's what the map is going to look like when it's done. And incidentally, if you happen to be using lava terrain to make something in the middle of the map here, it's important to be conscious about how that's going to work in King of the Hill games, since there's not really a point in having a monument in the middle here if literally no one will ever be able to access it. So that's why if we have a special King of the Hill case, we don't generate the lava here. Instead, we just generate normal rock terrain. So say if we just define King of the Hill, then instead of generating the lava here, we just generate the rock, and people would be able to access the monument. Now, thus far we've only talked about lava terrain in the context of random map scripting, but from a scenario designing perspective, we can use the terrain also. But it's important to know that the terrain mod only changes the graphics of the texture. So, for example, it does not, in our case, remove the limitation that moddable deep water is usually hidden in the editor. So, from a scenario designing perspective, if we were to change this variable from a 1 to a 0, we could save the data file, and then we would then have access to that terrain in the browser here when we go into our terrains. And then to avoid compatibility issues, when you're done drawing the lava, you can then change this back to a 1, so the data file is unchanged, and then the lava terrain will still remain in the scenario that you happen to be designing. So those are my tips for how to use lava in maps and or scenarios. So hopefully you guys can have some fun with it. I know I certainly do. So that's all for me for now. So thanks for watching.